Could Hero 30 and the next Overwatch map not only be linked, but could they also be released together? Am I right to put some faith in Blizzard, or am I just fucking nuts? Let's see, shall we? In 3, 2, 1. Da 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 da. Hi! How's it going, y'all? I'm Euclidean Vision, and as you may have guessed, today we're going to be discussing the next Overwatch map, its possible relevance to Hero 30, and the potential for them to release together in order to more clearly affect the ongoing story. Now, there's a few locations from the Overwatch canon that haven't seen interpretations in the game yet, and pretty much all of them can provide some substantial lore progression and help to flesh out their respective characters' backstories and future prospects. With the supposed map announcement at BlizzCon held back so that the map gets its own time to shine, suggestions of the map's actual significance are definitely present there. And with the last few heroes having had minimal effect on the overall story, it seemed pretty apt for Hero 30 of all things to be of more direct importance. For each of these kind of substantial events to not have any correlation would feel a bit out of whack personally, and it would be a step in a new direction for Blizzard to introduce and frame a new character predominantly through their associated map rather than through any other medium, especially given both the potential importances of the location and the hero themselves. Now for some proper conjecture to frame how or why I can see this happening. As the map's announcement was delayed, I think there's a possibility that the map itself could release a little later than previous years, possibly in February rather than the expected January. Also, given the present state of the game, public perception, Blizzard's ongoing work on multiple new heroes, and the game's dire need for their presence, especially in the tank and support categories, there have been ideas floating around regarding an increase in the release rate of heroes. Even increasing to 4 heroes per year and having one every 3 months could help to increase the variety in our games, keep the community engaged, which if implemented at this point would make the new hero release in February rather than the expected March. Releasing the map before the new hero, if they're linked together, could quite easily spoil the identity of that said hero, especially if there's someone we'll be familiar with in some way. So if both are linked, I think this could be a further factor behind their shared release date, along with giving us that stronger understanding of the new hero upon their release through that associated map. This does, however, leave January and March largely empty in terms of foreseeable content, which could point to the announcement of newer content to fill these slots, or could prove as further suggestion that they're not that concerned with developing new extraneous content, especially if they are picking up the hero release schedule. How this could affect the map release schedule is uncertain, especially if this simultaneous release is a one-off occurrence to push things forward or purely to highlight the milestone of the 30th hero. I'd obviously like to see maps introduced more regularly too, but let's walk before we can run. If I was being super hopeful, I'd say we'd see some kind of development in the story mediums during this downtime to help build up the hype or at least maintain some kind of engagement, especially as they apparently have a plan for the comics. They could also do some smaller mini events like they tried with the Nano Cola event to try and keep player interest up. But to be realistic, I don't really expect any of that to happen, especially given recent concerns regarding the upkeep of long-term titles at Activision Blizzard, but never mind that for now. So my supposition that Hero 30 and the new map will release simultaneously is actually pretty reductive in determining who and where we'll end up seeing. There's very few existing and relatively understood characters that could correlate to very few existing relatively understood locations. But that at least narrows down our possibilities to some quite determinate and sensible guesses. So let's first run through the possible locations we could see, and then we can see how the characters we know could tie into those, so we can see which characters would be aligned with which maps. So to start with one of the more general ideas, an Omnium. We haven't seen an Omnium in World or anything from the Omnica Corporation, and this would be huge for world building, especially in terms of the Omnics themselves and information about the Omnic Crisis, and there's also some link to more particular events from the Overwatch universe, like the Detroit Omnium is linked to the First Strike comic, whatever happened back there, that's not canon anymore, but it's at least linked somehow through the story. It must be an important location. And the Australian Omnium can give us more insight into ALF, the Australian Liberation Front, and the circumstances that led Australia to be in the state it's in now. I feel using one of the ruined ones, say the one in Australia or the one in Detroit, would be better than, say, the intact one in Numbani or the theoretically hostile ones in Siberia and the South China Sea, to allow for a greater focus on environmental storytelling without giving too much away. Although Siberia's would be interesting to teach us about the modern Omnic Crisis, while if we could have a map set inside the Grecian Omnium underwater, even more kinds of awesome are surely abound there. Given the relative geographical distribution of maps, however, and which maps have been released when, I feel that the ruins of the Detroit Omnium is the sort of most logical choice overall. Next location we're going to look at is kind of a theoretical location, the Iris. It was originally the name of a map in-game that has very possibly become the Nepal map, so it's unlikely to be a canon location at this point, but if it is an actual thing or a place, then it would definitely be interesting to see what that physical entity might be, to help progress our understanding of Omnics, the Shambali, Omnic sentience, and the Iris itself, if it is a thing. Connecting slightly to the Omnic idea is the idea of the Ironclad Guild. If they have an actual base somewhere in the world, with the development of smaller groups like the Deadlock Gang occurring across the Overwatch universe now, could this be a way to expand the Ironclad in the main roster, or even just to further expand the world building, especially as Torbjorn and Brigitte themselves don't have their own related map. But this would be useful for expanding on Torbjorn's relation to Omnic development and the Omnic crisis. Tying into Torbjorn again somewhat is Boklovo in Kyrgyzstan, the location of the Destroyer comic where Torbjorn came up against his old ally and now enemy Sven in the Titan mech that he'd constructed. This again would be more for furthering Torbjorn's storyline and his relation to Omnics and world power and weaponry and the effect it can have on the world. But it as a location isn't exactly that important, but another ruined location could be quite interesting to explore, especially if you could go inside the ruined Titan as well. Could be nice. One that's linked to sort of more characters in the world would be the Helix Security Prison, which obviously has links to existing characters in the game, say like Farah and Doomfist, but it could be a nice way to hint at some possible future villains, and it could be a good way to tell us some of the stories about villains of the past as well. Now for a slightly more focused location would be the Monaco Casino, that obviously has significant links to Talon and certain members of Talon. There could be a really fun and interactive map in the casino layout, and then could tell us much more about the story as we actually delve further into the building itself. Now for one that's linked to almost more locations and characters would be Utopia, supposedly the HQ for the Vishkar Corporation. Gives Symmetra a hometown map to relate back to her character, also allows for the introduction of new and existing characters as well to the game, as well as playing out Lucio and Vishkar's interactions with each other, Lucio's father's interactions with Vishkar, how Symmetra and Lucio react with each other as well. There's tons of story potential from introducing Utopia. And then finally, the Overwatch Swiss HQ, which would be amazing to have for sort of a core story understanding, especially surrounding Soldier 76 and Reaper's conflict back in the day. It could also serve as a location representative for Mercy, but it would definitely signal a return to the core storyline or act as a thematic parallel to the recalled Overwatch, but I imagine that map would be more likely to be saved for an Archives event. So that's all the known locations we have in World. And as you can probably see from some of those locations, we have some very determinate characters to link to them as well. Starting off with one that we know isn't going to be Hero 30, but could definitely see ties to several of these maps, is Echo. Echo could quite happily be tied to Utopia if her body was made by the Vishkar Corporation. She could have something to do with the Ironclad if they had something to do with her construction. She could very likely have something to do with the Iris, whatever it is, or the Omniums, or possibly the Overwatch Swiss HQ if she was still within Overwatch when the fall of Overwatch happened. So that's not exactly very likely to be coming out in February, as we know Echo isn't going to be Hero 30, and any location mentioned to an extent fits her character. So for a more determinate one, Sven, as I brought up Boklovo from the Destroyer comic, I again think this is quite unlikely, as Sven is quite an old character, possibly even largely forgotten at this point. His character arc is somewhat concluded, we've learnt what his motivations are and the logic he uses to disguise his more sinister motives, and his relation to Torbjorn and how both of their ideologies clash against each other. Both the character and the location lack any severe importance, but using them as a new hero and a new map could help invigorate those concepts back into the world, and obviously gives Torbjorn a sort of analogue on the opposing side, who at least seems to have a possibly workable kit based on his character design. Unsure. So looking at a bit more of a fan favourite, the Junker Queen. Again, quite unlikely, as the Junker Queen already has her own associated map, literally her hometown of Junkertown, and the Australian Omnium has more logical connection at least to Maker Rutledge, Roadhog, but he also, again, already has quite a strong connection to Junkertown as it is. We also had Hammond released relatively recently to associate to Junkertown, all of which has pretty limited importance to the core story. The only location I can see them introducing that could relate to the Junker Queen by any further extent would be the Australian Omnium, and as one of the more limited options in that list, I don't think that's a very strong choice. The Junker Queen, I imagine, would be released on her own at some point in the future, unless the ALF development is more impactful than we know at present. Like the Junker Queen, there is yet another fan favourite character associated to an already existing map. Everybody's favourite gender-fluid, bunny-eared Omnic hacker, Link 17. Despite their association to an already existing map, I think there are one or two examples that I've highlighted that Blizzard could use to facilitate the introduction of Link 17. The most obvious would be their hometown Omnium in Numbani, but as that's already going to be quite similar to Numbani, the map itself, I don't see that being the case. The more out there idea I can see would be the Siberian Omnium, being used as sort of a focal point for Lynx if they were to go and visit their new budding friend Zarya. This would be a bit different from usual, as the map association would be more of a plotline association rather than a general background one. But as neither of these maps are particularly likely in themselves, and Lynx already has an associated map, I again would imagine Lynx's release to feature just the hero themselves, hopefully at some point in the near future. So moving on to my favourite possible location, the Monaco Casino and Maximilian. I think this is certainly possible. Maximilian definitely has some importance to the story. The casino at least has some importance as a central hub for Talon besides Rialto. It's possibly more closely linked to the overall plot than most of the other locations mentioned. It also has several characters linked to it, as the entirety of Talon at least, and Maximilian himself, but it has less determinate links to other heroes and the wider world than Utopia, that I feel would be used to introduce Sanjay Korpal, which at this point I'd argue that this is by far the most likely choice. It allows development for Symmetra herself, Vishkar itself, Lucio's interaction with both of those characters, and then Sanjay's interaction with all of those characters and situations and Talon itself. They could even, as I mentioned, also possibly link back to Echo and the overall plot. Vishkar could be far more important than we actually know at this point. The corporations have quite often been used by the Overwatch story to facilitate story progression. So that is my prediction for the upcoming map and Hero 30. They will both release together sometime into February, and is most likely to be Utopia facilitating the introduction of Sanjay Korpal into the game proper. Although I, for one, will be super excited if it's actually Monaco and Maximilian. If you think I'm full of shit, let me know in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say at least. Thanks for staying with me. I've been Euclidean Vision. May the glorious light of Best Girl shine within you. Goodbye.